Today we'll be reading Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 through 15. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace, and be thankful.
Been studying the book of Philippians, looking at some joy lessons from the first chapters where we are thus far. As we continue today, I would like to move on to verse 27 and 28, and we'll at least get started on this text today. Just one thing, Paul says. Live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then whether I come and see you or am absent, I will hear about you, that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, working side by side with the faith of the gospel, not being frightened in any way by your opponents. This is evidence of their destruction, but of your deliverance, and this is from God. I entitled this lesson, Just One Thing. Paul has laid out in the first chapter how that we should be people who celebrate joy within community, saints who have lowered themselves to become servants and slaves, and how we have so much to live for. God has destined us. We don't live with the turmoil of the world. But then Paul has begun to talk about joy during times of adversity, and he's talked about his own life and how there are things happening in his life that are far from being ideal. And yet, he is able to find joy within those troubles. So he has talked about his troubles, and he now is going to say there's just one thing, just one more thing. He has said it doesn't matter whether he lives or die, his joy continues. He has said if he lives, he'll be able to help the Philippians, and that will be benefit to them, but if he dies, that will be gain, because he'll be able to be reunited with the Lord. So he shared that, and now then it's like, okay, but all of that's really immaterial. There's just one thing. There's just one thing. I want to begin by noticing that there's a great diversity of translation as to how they begin verse 27. For example, the NIV says, whatever happens. The New American, the ESV, the King James, and the Revised say only as they begin that verse. The New Living says above all. And the Holman Standard Bible, Standard Christian Bible, says just one thing. So obviously there's diversity within the wording here, which led me to look at some of the original word and perhaps gain some insight into what was used here. The Greek word that appears is monon, which usually means merely. It is from monos, which means remaining, the sole, the single, without companion. It has to do with a singularity. In classical Greek, it was used to represent energy or strength. So what Paul does here is he says, there's just this one thing, this sole thing that matters. There's just this only thing that is significant, that needs to take up your space, and it needs to take up your heart. Other occurrences of the word help us to perhaps get that impression. For example, in Matthew chapter 4 and verse 4, when Jesus said, you don't live by bread alone. The word alone is this word monon. Also, Matthew chapter 18, it says, if you see a brother in sin, you go to him in private. And that's a translation of this word, or a form of this word. In Luke chapter 24, when the disciples come to the tomb and find the body of Jesus is no longer there, but it says the linen wrappings only were in the tomb. So they were solely in there. They were the one thing. And in Philippians chapter 2, verse 27, when Paul says that they had prayed for Epaphroditus and God had spared him, he said it was a blessing not only on him alone, but also for the church in Philippi. And then it also appears in chapter 4 of the book of Philippians when Paul says giving and receiving. Not everybody was giving and receiving to Paul, but them alone. So you get the idea. The original word has to do with the singularity, this oneness. The idea that is expressed is that there's a uniqueness, there's an individuality, there's a singleness that's involved here. And the word as it appears in the context of verse 27 bears this all out. Here's literally what we have to understand. Prior to these verses, Paul is talking about, I'm content. If I'm released from prison, hey, that's fine. If my life ends, hey, that's okay. My joy is going to continue. So neither one of those things really matter. But he says there is something larger. There's something more significant than my expectation of freedom or whatever else the Lord decides to bring into my situation. There's something more significant. There is just one thing. There is just one thing. The single thing more significant than Paul's future. The single thing that was more important than whether the church got to work with Paul again. The single thing that was the single thing was this: live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. That's it. The one thing that's the one thing. The one thing that's important, regardless of what happens to Paul, regardless of what happens with the Philippian church, the one thing is that those people live their life in a manner worthy of the gospel. The NIV says, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. The ESV, let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. The one thing to which every Christian must pay attention is their worthy walk within the gospel of Jesus Christ. Worthy in the Greek is the word axios, and it means appropriate, deserving, or suitable. Here's what Vine's Expository Dictionary says of that word. It has to do with weighing, having weight, having the weight of another thing of like value, worth as much. Now, that's quite a statement. When Paul says the one thing that is the one thing is that your life is worthy of the life of Jesus. Wow. Live your life in such a way that it weighs out in the scale. It's worth the price that was paid for it. Is my life balancing out with the price that God was willing to pay for me? Now, I realize, folks, that none of us will ever be worthy of the gift. It was a gift beyond our worthiness. I know sometimes we struggle with what it means for us to be worthy. We read the passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 about eating the supper in an unworthy manner, and we think that has to do with whether we've balanced out or not, when that literally is talking about the manner in which we eat it. But what Paul is saying here, walking in a manner that is worthy of the gospel, he's saying, you're in balance. Your life is lived in such a way that it's the same weight as the price that was paid. And the reason that's he's able to do that is because he's not enforcing that. He's saying, you as a follower, you, if you're going to enjoy this full joy measure of life, you've got to come to grips with the fact that your life needs to weigh equal to the gospel, to the price that was paid. That's the challenge that he gives to these people. To be befitting, agreeable, to correspond to a thing. That's what Vine says this word means. When all is boiled down to the lowest spiritual denominator, it's always a question of how much one's own life balances out with the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's always where it ends up. My actions are to always be weighed by the measure, the rule, the governance of the new king. That is some astonishing command, isn't it? When you think about living your life in a way that balances out to the good news that was paid for you. Who doesn't struggle with keeping our attitudes and our actions equalized with what the gospel calls us to be. We do. And I think that's why God is always He's so aware of our humanness when he inspires the writers. Here's Paul, and he says, I want you to walk in a manner worthy. That's the one thing. It's the one thing. It's the only thing. You weigh your life. And the reader sit here and goes, wow, that's really heavy. That's a big challenge. But then what happens is Paul goes from there and he explains what that is. And again, the challenge is going to be just as challenging, but at least we're going to be able to understand it. So what happens is we go back to this text and look at the first thing, and that's all we'll take time to look at today. The first thing that Paul says, just one thing, live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then whether I come and see you or am absent, I will hear that you're standing firm in one spirit. There's the first thing. You want to know if your life is balancing out, if you're living a life that is worthy of the gospel, then the first thing to ask is, am I being firm in one spirit? I find this whole language really intriguing. To be firm in one spirit. That must mean it's easy not to be in one spirit. So let me tell you, in my years of ministry, we began in an apprentice program in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Worked for a congregation there, had some friends that were there, knew several people there, and that body struggled with being one spirit. So then we had opportunity to move to Montana. We moved to Butte, Montana, and worked with the body there. And I can tell you that that body struggled with being one-spirited. And then we went to Williston, North Dakota. And I can tell you that body struggled with maintaining one spirit. And then we went to Sidney, Montana. Congregation largely made up of 3 families. And I can tell you that body struggled with being one spirit. Then we moved to Lincoln, Nebraska, almost 20 years ago. And you know what, folks? We struggle with being one spirit. Because it's part of the struggle, part of the fight that Russ referred to in the adult class this morning. It's part of that never-ending struggle. And as God's family, we struggle standing firm in our one-spiritedness. It actually is a term that came to prominence as a defensive term for the Roman army. They would stand shoulder to shoulder and back to back with shields and spears in front of them and create basically a powerful defensive position by being one of one spirit. The Spirit that Paul's discussing, no way we should consider this the Holy Spirit. There isn't a translation. There are no translators that put it as the Holy Spirit. It's talking about something entirely different. It is a spirit. It is the way people breathe, because the word spirit means breath. It is the word pneuma. We get pneumatic and pneumonia. We get all of those terms because pneumo means breath. And so what Paul is saying is we need to be of a single breath. I want you people, in living your life worthy of the gospel, I want you to be one breath, breathing the same thing. Paul is saying that one measure of living worthy is how you breathe within and about your spiritual body. Being able to stand in one breath has nothing to do with there being no problems or imperfections in the church body. This is not a command which only applies if I eventually join a body of believers that contains no shortages and no stinky sheep. The reality is, every body I've ever worked with, every church that has ever sought to follow Jesus Christ through all the times of history has struggled to remain one spirit, and yet that is what everyone is supposed to be. We are supposed to be of one spirit. We stand firm in our one spiritness, and that's part of our walking worthy of the gospel. Even the Philippian church has two women who are fighting. And in chapter 4, Paul urges a brother to help them work it out, and they can be in agreement in the Lord. They can be at odds, at differences, at different ends of a spectrum in the way they think, yet they can be one-spirited. Folks, we have not learned that lesson. We have thought if we're opposite ends of a spectrum in the way we think, that we don't have to be one-spirited. And exactly the opposite is true. Being of one spirit is rooted in our mutual agreement to be in the Lord. That's where it comes from. Let's just look at how our physical body works. There's not a person in this room who is sitting here going, I need to breathe in, I need to breathe out, I need to breathe in, I need to breathe. You don't have to do that. Why? All hooked up on this involuntary system, and it just happens, right? You just breathe, you just breathe, you just breathe, you just breathe. It's just part of the way God made our physical body. Guess what? That's also the way God made the spiritual body. There's supposed to be a singleness of breath that comes in and out of the spiritual body. And you and I are not in control of that. Something bigger than us is. We are one spirit because of our head. We may not agree on all things, yet we all have this spiritual breathing apparatus that makes us one. The oneness of spirit was exactly what Jesus prayed for. Remember in John chapter 17, as Jesus is walking with his disciples, and he begins to pray. And he says, may they all be one. As you, Father, and are in me, and I in them, may they also be one in us. You see where the oneness comes from? In us. So that the world may believe that you have sent me. Jesus said, I want the believers in me. I want them to be one spirit, Father, just like you and I are one spirit. Let me ask you this. What does the word ecclesia mean? Ek means out, and lesia has to do with being called. So literally, the word means called out. Sometimes we would say, well, it means church, etc. When we think of called out, we typically think of being separated from the world, which again, our video material has prepared all of this very well for our discussion today. Called out, separated from the world. While it does hold that meaning, the primary emphasis of that word has never been on separateness. It's always been on togetherness. And it says something about us when we focus on the word meaning called out, and we think it has to do with separating ourselves. Because what the word actually focuses on is how people are together because they've been called out of one existence, but they've been called into another. The word means a gathering, an assembly, or a congregation. That's why when you read in many passages in your New Testament, the word ecclesia will appear, and it'll be translated church. It'll be translated body. It'll be translated assembly. Why? Because it's about together, not about apart, not about separation. It's about togetherness. Yes, we are called out of the world, but that is not the emphasis of the word. The emphasis is on togetherness. When we think about the church being separate, we tend to believe it is good to separate ourselves from even Christians with whom we don't agree. When we think we are called out because we're supposed to be pure and identifiable by certain standards that we set, then we think we should separate. And folks, that's why we struggle with one spirit, because that's what we've taught ourselves and believed. You know, ironically, do you know what the word Pharisee means? Separated. Church, we do not create unity. We don't create the oneness that we're talking about. Our oneness is accomplished when we, by one Spirit, we're all baptized into one body. It is our responsibility, according to Ephesians 4 and verse 3, to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. We're not in the one Spirit making business. We're in the one Spirit maintaining business. The maintenance manual for unity includes things like bearing with one another, One Spirit living, breathing, is I learn to bear with. Bear with. And you learn to bear with. And we mutually bear with each other because we're one Spirit. It includes things like remembering that the worthy walk is the one thing. It includes things like not quarreling over matters that don't matter, opinions, perspectives, preferences that don't matter. Romans chapter 14 is very plain about that. So our responsibility is to maintain unity. When we are one Spirit, we stick together because Jesus said it is our connectedness that proves to the world that we are his disciples. Now, none of this justifies overlooking rebellious sin. It doesn't mean we accept all things. We're not total tolerance. But what it does mean is that we don't let our preferences, our agendas, and our personalities divide us. Because when we do, we say to Jesus, I don't care what the world thinks about you. You see, Jesus said the method that will convince the world that I'm God's son is when you people are one. When you are one Spirit. People can't deny that. That's supernatural. Doesn't come from us. The attitude of I'd rather be right by myself than wrong with you should never have a foothold in the body of Jesus. We should all be committed to an attitude that says, I make it my goal to be together with you, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that happens. This is why Paul addresses the people that he loves with the challenge to remain firm in one Spirit. Next time we're going to look at three other elements that Paul identifies as contributors to our worthy walk. Today we set the stage. There's just one thing, and that is that we walk worthy. As we anticipate and process what does it mean to walk worthy, the first thing Paul says, it means to be firm in one Spirit.